Every parent's worst nightmare became reality for the Morrison family on a cold February morning. 6-year-old Lily lost everything in one terrible moment: her ability to walk and her voice. Frank Morrison, her widowed grandfather, was now raising a child who lived in complete silence. He understood car engines, not broken hearts. When he wheeled Lily into the local animal shelter that rainy afternoon, he was desperate for anything that might help. Among all the barking dogs, one golden retriever named Buddy walked straight to Lily and gently placed his paw on her knee. For the first time in months, she smiled. This simple act would become the beginning of something miraculous. Could this gentle dog become the key to healing not just Lily, but her grandfather's wounded heart too? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank Morrison had never imagined his retirement would look like this. At 72, he'd planned to spend his golden years tinkering in his garage, maybe taking the occasional fishing trip to Lake Hartwell. Instead, he found himself staring at a bowl of untouched cereal across from a little girl who hadn't spoken a word in 8 months. The kitchen of his modest ranch home felt too quiet, despite the morning news playing softly on the counter television. Lily sat in her wheelchair, her dark hair falling like a curtain around her pale face, her small hands folded in her lap. She'd been beautiful once, vibrant and chattering like a magpie, just like her mother had been at that age. Now, she seemed fragile as porcelain, as if one wrong word might shatter what remained of her spirit. Frank's weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug, the ceramic warm against his calloused palms. 47 years of fixing engines had taught him that every problem had a solution. You just had to find the right tool and apply the right pressure in the right place. But children weren't carburetors, hearts weren't transmissions, and he was running out of ideas. The accident had changed everything. One moment, his daughter Sarah was driving Lily home from ballet practice, laughing about something silly that had happened in class. The next, a drunk driver had run a red light and stolen everything that mattered. Sarah died instantly. Lily survived, but the spinal injury left her paralyzed from the waist down, and somehow the trauma had locked away her voice along with her ability to walk. Frank had become her guardian by default, the only family she had left. His wife Martha had passed 5 years earlier from cancer, leaving him alone in a house that felt too big and too empty. Now it felt too small and too full of grief. "Would you like to try some toast, sweetheart?" he asked gently, though he knew she wouldn't respond. She rarely acknowledged his questions anymore, though sometimes he caught her watching him with those serious brown eyes that looked so much like Sarah's. The social worker, Mrs. Peterson, visited twice a week. She spoke in measured tones about processing trauma and finding alternative communication methods, but Frank could see the concern growing in her expression with each visit. The doctors said there was nothing physically wrong with Lily's vocal cords. The silence was emotional, psychological, a prison she'd built around herself that no key seemed to fit. Dr. Sarah Chen, the child psychologist they'd been seeing for 3 months, was kind and patient, but even she seemed to be running out of strategies. Play therapy, art therapy, music therapy. Lily participated minimally, mechanically, like she was going through motions without truly being present. The neighbors tried to help. Mrs. Rodriguez next door often brought casseroles and offers to babysit, though Lily wouldn't interact with her either. Tom and Betty from across the street had grandchildren Lily's age and had suggested play dates, but Lily showed no interest in other children. She seemed to exist in a bubble of silence that nothing could penetrate. Frank's garage had become his refuge. When the weight of his inadequacy became too heavy, he'd retreat to the familiar smell of motor oil and metal, losing himself in the honest work of fixing things that could actually be fixed. But even there, surrounded by tools that had never failed him, he felt helpless. The physical therapy sessions were the hardest to watch. Lily complied with the exercises, but without enthusiasm, without hope. The therapist, a cheerful woman named Jennifer, worked tirelessly to strengthen Lily's upper body and maintain flexibility in her legs. But progress was slow. Sometimes Frank wondered if Lily even wanted to get stronger or if she'd given up on everything. Mealtime had become a silent ritual. Frank would prepare simple foods he thought a 6-year-old might enjoy: grilled cheese sandwiches, chicken nuggets, mac and cheese from a box. And she would eat enough to survive, but never with pleasure. He'd tried taking her out for ice cream, once thinking it might spark some joy, but she'd stared at the melting vanilla scoop with the same detached expression she wore for everything else. The house felt haunted by the ghost of who Lily used to be. Her bedroom still contained evidence of her former life: a bookshelf full of picture books she used to beg him to read when she visited, a collection of stuffed animals that now sat neglected in a corner, art supplies that gathered dust on her small desk. Frank couldn't bear to put them away, holding on to hope that someday she might reach for a crayon or ask for a story. Sleep didn't come easily for either of them. Frank often heard soft sounds from Lily's room, not crying exactly, but restless movements that told him she was struggling with nightmares he couldn't chase away. He'd installed a baby monitor so he could hear if she needed help, but she never called out. Sometimes he wished she would scream or cry or demand something from him. Anger would be better than this terrible, crushing silence. The accident had left its mark on him too. Every time he got behind the wheel, he thought about Sarah and that moment when everything changed. Every time he looked at Lily, he saw his daughter's face and felt the weight of promises he'd made to protect his family, promises he'd failed to keep. Mrs. Peterson had mentioned support groups for grandparents raising grandchildren, but Frank couldn't imagine sitting in a circle talking about feelings with strangers. He was a man who solved problems with his hands, not his words. But his hands felt useless now, too big and clumsy for the delicate work of healing a broken heart. The television droned on with news of distant troubles, wars and politics and disasters that felt far removed from their small world of silence and sorrow. Frank reached for the remote to turn down the volume, then thought better of it. At least it was sound, filling the space where conversation should be. Outside, October rain tapped against the windows with steady persistence. The trees in his backyard were beginning to turn, their leaves shifting from green to gold to brown, a reminder that time kept moving whether they were ready or not. Frank wondered if Lily noticed the changing seasons anymore, or if the world beyond their kitchen window had become as grey and distant to her as everything else. He finished his coffee and began clearing the breakfast dishes, a routine as familiar and hollow as all the others. Lily remained at the table, her small hands now tracing patterns on the placemat, one of the few signs of life she still showed. Sometimes Frank caught her drawing invisible pictures with her finger, and he wondered what stories lived in her. Mind trapped behind walls of silence he couldn't scale. Today would be like yesterday and the day before that. Physical therapy at 10, lunch in silence, an afternoon of Lily sitting by the window while Frank tried to find busy work that kept his hands occupied and his mind from dwelling on everything he didn't know how to fix. Evening would bring another quiet dinner, another night of restless sleep, and tomorrow would begin the cycle again. But something in the persistent drum of rain against glass made Frank feel restless. Maybe it was the approaching anniversary of the accident, or maybe it was Mrs. Peterson's gentle suggestion that they needed to try something different, something that might reach Lily in ways traditional therapy hadn't. Whatever it was, Frank found himself thinking about change, about risk, about the possibility that sitting in this careful routine might be doing more harm than good. As he loaded the dishwasher, Frank made a decision that would alter everything, though he didn't know it yet. Tomorrow he would try something different. Tomorrow he would take Lily somewhere new, The idea was small and uncertain, like the first crack in ice before the spring thaw, but it was the first new idea he'd had in months. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the world clean and preparing it for whatever was coming next. The idea came to Frank during the sleepless hours before dawn, when rational thought mixed with desperation to create something that might have been hope. He'd been lying in bed, listening to the old house settle around them, when he remembered something Martha used to say. Sometimes the best medicine comes on 4 legs and a wagging tail. They'd never had pets when Sarah was growing up. Frank's long hours at the garage and Martha's job at the elementary school had left little time for the additional responsibility of caring for an animal. But Martha had always been drawn to dogs, stopping to pet every friendly face they encountered. On their walks through town, after breakfast, another silent affair with Lily managing only a few bites of toast, Frank made his decision. He wheeled Lily to her room and helped her into a warm sweater, noting how she allowed him to dress her without resistance, but also without participation. Her compliance had become as troubling as her silence. "We're going somewhere different. Today," he said gently, though he didn't expect a response. "Somewhere I think you might find interesting." The drive to Maplewood Animal Shelter took them through the heart of their small South Carolina town. Frank had lived here his entire life, watching it grow from a farming community to a place where young families came seeking affordable homes, and older folks came to retire. The shelter sat on the outskirts, in a converted farmhouse surrounded by large fenced yards where rescued dogs could run and play. Frank had called ahead, speaking with a volunteer named Carol, who assured him that they welcomed visitors, especially children who might benefit from animal interaction. She'd asked no probing questions about Lily's condition, for which Frank was grateful. He'd grown tired of explaining their situation to well-meaning strangers. The October air was crisp and clean after yesterday's rain, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of winter. Frank parked near the entrance and retrieved Lily's wheelchair from the back of his pickup truck, a routine they'd perfected through months of practice. Lily waited patiently as he positioned the chair and helped her transfer from the passenger seat, her small body feeling fragile in his arms. The shelter's lobby was warm and welcoming, with bulletin boards covered in photos of success stories. Happy families posing with newly adopted pets. The sounds of barking dogs echoed from the back of the building, a symphony of hope and longing that made Frank's chest tight. Carol appeared almost immediately, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and gentle hands that showed years of caring for abandoned animals. "You must be Frank and Lily," she said warmly, kneeling to Lily's eye level. "I'm so glad you came to visit us today. Would you like to meet some of our dogs?" Lily's expression didn't change, but she didn't pull away when Carol reached out to shake her small hand. Frank took this as encouragement. They followed Carol through a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only" into a corridor lined with kennels. The barking grew louder, and Frank worried it might overwhelm Lily, but she seemed to focus on the sounds with more attention than she'd shown anything in weeks. "We have about 30 dogs right now," Carol explained as they walked. "All different, ages and sizes. Some came to us as strays, some were surrendered by families who could no longer care for them. Each one has a story, but they all have one thing in common. They're looking for love." They stopped at the first kennel, where a small terrier mix bounced excitedly against the gate. "This is Patches," Carol said. "He's been with us for 2 months, full of energy and loves to play fetch." Lily watched the dog with mild interest, but showed no desire to interact. They moved to the next kennel, home to an elderly beagle who approached. The gait with dignity and a slowly wagging tail, then a pit bull mix with gentle eyes and a hopeful expression, followed by a pair of bonded siblings who had to be adopted together. Frank began to worry that this had been another failed attempt, another disappointment to add to their growing collection. Lily observed each dog politely, but remained emotionally distant, her hands folded in her lap like she was attending a lecture rather than meeting potential friends. Then they reached the last kennel in the row. Inside, a golden retriever, sat calmly on a worn blanket, not jumping or barking like most of the other dogs, but watching their approach with intelligent brown eyes. His coat was slightly dull, suggesting he'd been at the shelter for some time, and he wore a faded red collar that had seen better days. "This is Buddy," Carol said, her voice taking on a softer tone. "He came to us about 6 months ago. He's different from our other dogs, quieter, more thoughtful. Sometimes I think he understands more than he lets on." As they stopped in front of his kennel, Buddy rose slowly and approached the gate. But instead of seeking attention from Frank or Carol, his gaze went directly to Lily. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition that Frank couldn't name but could feel in the sudden stillness of the air around them. "He's beautiful," Frank said, though his words felt inadequate. There was something about this dog that was different, something that made the busy sounds of the shelter fade into background noise. Carol unlatched the kennel gate. "Would you like to meet him properly? He's very gentle." Buddy stepped out of his kennel with calm dignity, ignoring Frank's outstretched hand and Carol's encouraging words. Instead, he walked directly to Lily's wheelchair and with careful deliberation placed his right paw on her knee. The effect was immediate and startling. For the first time since the accident, Lily's face transformed. Her eyes widened, her lips parted slightly, and something that might have been wonder crossed her features. She stared down at the paw resting on her knee, then up at Buddy's patient face, and slowly, so slowly that Frank held his breath, she lifted her hand. Her small fingers touched Buddy's golden fur, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. Buddy remained perfectly still, as if he understood the significance of this moment, as if he knew that any sudden movement might break the spell. And then it happened. The corners of Lily's mouth lifted in what could only be called a smile. Not the polite, dutiful expression she sometimes wore for doctors and therapists, but a real smile that reached her eyes and transformed her entire face. Frank felt tears spring to his eyes. Carol made a small sound of surprise and delight. But Buddy simply stood there, his paw still resting on Lily's knee, his tail giving a single gentle wag. "I think," Carol said softly, "that Buddy has been waiting for someone exactly like Lily." The rest of the adoption process passed in a blur of paperwork and practical arrangements. Frank learned that Buddy was approximately 4 years old, house-trained, and had been surrendered by a previous owner who could no longer care for him. His medical record showed he was healthy and up to date on all vaccinations. The adoption fee was modest, and Carol seemed more interested in ensuring Buddy would have a good home than in collecting payment. Throughout the proceedings, Buddy remained close to Lily's wheelchair, occasionally resting his chin on her armrest or gently nosing her hand. And Lily, miracle of miracles, continued to pet him, her fingers exploring his soft ears and the silky fur of his neck. When it came time to leave, Frank worried that Lily might retreat back into herself, that the magic of this moment might not survive the transition to their everyday world. But as he lifted her from the wheelchair to the truck, Buddy jumped into the passenger seat without invitation and settled beside her as if he'd always belonged there. The drive home was different from any they'd taken since the accident. Lily's attention was completely focused on Buddy, who seemed content to sit quietly beside her, occasionally turning to look at her with those wise, brown eyes. Frank found himself stealing glances in the rearview mirror, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. As they pulled into their driveway, Frank realized that for the first time in 8 months, he felt something that might have been hope. It was fragile and tentative, like the first green shoots after a hard winter, but it was real. Whatever happened next, today had been different. Today, something had changed. Buddy hopped down from the truck and waited patiently while Frank helped Lily into her wheelchair. Then, without being asked or encouraged, he took his place beside her chair and followed them toward the house, as if he'd finally found where he was meant to be. The golden autumn light filtering through the oak trees in their yard seemed brighter than it had all season, and Frank allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were all exactly where they needed to be. The first challenge became apparent before they'd even crossed the threshold. Frank stood in his doorway, holding the door open, while Lily maneuvered her wheelchair through the entrance, and realized he'd never considered how a large dog would fit into their carefully arranged living space. Buddy paused at the threshold, looking up at Frank as if asking permission. "Come on in, boy," Frank said, and Buddy stepped inside with the same calm dignity he'd shown at the shelter. The house felt different immediately, not just because of Buddy's physical presence, but because Lily was different. She'd positioned her wheelchair so she could watch Buddy as he explored their living room, taking in new scents and sights with patient curiosity. Her sketch pad, usually forgotten in her lap, lay open with a pencil in her hand. Frank noticed she'd drawn something during the car ride home, rough lines that might have been a dog's face. That first evening brought a series of small revelations and adjustments. Frank had stopped at the pet store on their way home, loading up on the basics: food and water bowls, a leash, a bed, and a selection of toys he hoped might engage both Lily and Buddy. But it quickly became clear that Buddy's needs were simpler than the store's elaborate displays suggested. He showed no interest in squeaky toys or rope pulls. Instead, he seemed content to lie on the living room floor near Lily's wheelchair, occasionally lifting his head when she moved or made a sound. When Frank placed the expensive orthopedic dog bed in the corner, Buddy ignored it, preferring the worn area rug that positioned him closest to Lily. Dinner preparation became a shared activity for the first time since Lily had come to live with him. While Frank heated soup and prepared sandwiches, Lily remained in the kitchen, sketching in her pad while keeping one hand available to pet Buddy when he approached. The dog seemed to understand that meal times were important, settling beside her chair without begging or creating distraction. "What do you think, Lily?" Frank asked as he set a bowl of water on the floor. "Should we put Buddy's food dish here, or would you prefer it over by the window?" She looked up from her sketchpad, the first time she'd made eye contact with him in weeks, and pointed toward the window. Frank moved the food dish, and Lily returned to her drawing with what might have been satisfaction. The real test came at bedtime. Frank had assumed Buddy would sleep in the living room, but as he helped Lily with her evening routine, the dog followed them down the hallway. When Frank transferred Lily from her wheelchair to her bed, Buddy lay down on the floor beside her, his presence creating a sense of security that had been missing from their household for months. "I think he wants to stay with you tonight," Frank said. "Is that all right?" Lily's response was to reach down and touch Buddy's head, her fingers tangling gently in his fur. Frank took that as a yes. He'd expected the first night to be difficult. New sounds, different routines, the adjustment period that came with any significant change. But the house was quieter than it had been in months. No restless movements from Lily's room, no soft sounds of distress that usually drifted through the baby monitor. When Frank checked on them around midnight, he found Lily sleeping deeply, with one hand trailing over the edge of the bed, her fingers resting on Buddy's back. The next morning brought their first real challenge. Dr. Sarah Chen was scheduled for her regular visit, and Frank worried about how Buddy's presence might affect the session. Dr. Chen had been working patiently with Lily for months, using play therapy and art activities to encourage communication, but progress had been minimal. When the doorbell rang, Buddy's response surprised Frank. Instead of barking or rushing to the door like most dogs, he simply lifted his head and looked toward the sound, then returned his attention to Lily. It was as if he understood that in this household his job was not to be a guard dog, but to be a companion. Dr. Chen was a petite woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and an endless supply of patience. She'd seen Lily through some of her darkest moments and had never shown frustration with the lack of progress, but Frank could see concern growing in her expression with each visit. "This is Buddy," Frank explained as he led Dr. Chen into the living room. "We adopted him yesterday." If Dr. Chen was surprised by this development, she didn't show it. Instead, she knelt beside Lily's wheelchair and greeted both girl and dog with equal warmth. "Hello, Lily, and hello, Buddy. What a handsome friend you have here." The session proceeded differently from their usual routine. Typically, Dr. Chen would set up activities at the coffee table, while Lily participated with mechanical compliance. Today, Lily's attention was divided between the art supplies Dr. Chen offered and Buddy's calm presence beside her chair. "Would you like to draw something for me today?" Dr. Chen asked, arranging colored pencils and paper within Lily's reach. For the first time in months, Lily reached for the art supplies without prompting. Her small hand selected a golden yellow pencil, and she began to draw with more focus and intention than Frank had seen since before the accident. The sketch that emerged was clearly recognizable as a dog, not sophisticated but unmistakably Buddy, complete with his gentle eyes and patient expression. Dr. Chen watched with barely contained excitement, but she was professional enough not to make too much of the moment. "That's a beautiful drawing, Lily. Would you like to show it to Buddy?" Lily held up her sketch, and Buddy looked at the paper with the same serious attention he gave everything else in their household. His tail gave a single wag, and Lily's face lit up with that same transformative smile Frank had witnessed at the shelter. The rest of the session continued with small breakthroughs. Lily completed 2 more drawings, one of herself in her wheelchair, with Buddy beside her, and another that appeared to be their house with all 3 of them in the front yard. She didn't speak, but she was more present and engaged than she'd been in any previous session. When Dr. Chen prepared to leave, she pulled Frank aside while Lily was occupied, showing Buddy her drawings. "This is remarkable," she said quietly. "I've never seen her this responsive. Whatever made you decide to get a dog, it was inspired." Frank felt a flush of pride mixed with relief. He chose her, really. At the shelter, he walked right to her, like he'd been waiting. "Animals can be incredibly therapeutic for trauma survivors," Dr. Chen explained. "There's something about their unconditional acceptance and non-judgmental presence that can break through barriers human interaction can't penetrate. I'd like to modify our approach to include Buddy in future sessions, if that's all right with you." After Dr. Chen left, Frank found himself watching Lily and Buddy with new understanding. The dog's presence wasn't just comforting, it was actively healing. Buddy seemed to sense when Lily needed comfort, when she was withdrawing into herself, when she was ready for gentle interaction. He was patient when she wanted to pet him, undemanding when she needed space, and consistently present in a way that promised permanence. That afternoon, they attempted their first walk together. Frank had been concerned about managing both Lily's wheelchair and Buddy's leash, but the dog seemed to understand the logistics intuitively. He walked at exactly the right pace, never pulling or straining against the leash, automatically adjusting his speed when they navigated curbs or uneven sidewalks. Mrs. Rodriguez came out of her house as they passed, her face lighting up when she saw their new addition. "What a beautiful dog!" she exclaimed. "And look at that smile, Lily. I haven't seen you smile like that in so long." Frank braced himself for Lily's usual withdrawal in the presence of neighbors, but instead, she reached down to pet Buddy's head, her smile remaining in place. It was as if Buddy's presence gave her permission to engage with the world again, one small interaction at a time. They completed a full circle around the block, the farthest Lily had traveled from the house since coming to live with Frank. When they returned home, she seemed more tired than usual, but it was the good kind of tired that comes from activity and fresh air rather than the exhaustion of grief. That evening, as Frank prepared dinner, he realized the house felt different in ways he was still discovering. There were new sounds, the gentle jingle of Buddy's collar when he moved, the soft pad of his feet on the hardwood floors, the contented sighs he made when settling beside Lily's chair. But more than that, there was a sense of wholeness that had been missing since Sarah's death. For the first time in months, Frank found himself looking forward to tomorrow. By the end of their first week together, Buddy had established routines that seemed to anticipate Lily's needs before she expressed them. He woke each morning just before her alarm, positioning himself beside her bed so she could reach down and pet him as she slowly emerged from sleep. During breakfast, he would rest his chin on her wheelchair armrest, not begging for food, but simply maintaining the connection that had become essential to both of them. Frank observed these interactions with growing amazement. Buddy seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of Lily's physical limitations and emotional needs. When she struggled with particularly challenging physical therapy exercises, he would move closer, offering his solid presence as comfort. When she became frustrated with her wheelchair's maneuverability, he would walk beside her at exactly the right pace, never getting tangled in the wheels or creating additional obstacles. The breakthrough came during their second week together. Frank had been helping Lily with her morning routine when he noticed her reaching for her art supplies without prompting. Over the past days, her sketches had become more detailed and expressive. She'd moved beyond simple drawings of Buddy to create elaborate scenes. Buddy running through fields she'd never seen him run through. Buddy playing with children who existed only in her imagination. Buddy performing heroic rescues that spoke to her deep need for safety and protection. But this morning was different. Lily opened her sketch pad to a fresh page and began working on something more ambitious than her usual drawings. Frank tried not to hover, busying himself with household tasks while keeping one eye on her progress. When she finally set down her pencil, he approached carefully. On the page was a detailed scene of their living room, but not as it existed now. In Lily's drawing, the furniture had been rearranged to create open spaces where a wheelchair could move freely. Buddy was depicted in the center of the room wearing what appeared to be a colorful harness, and Lily, for the first time since the accident, had drawn herself standing. Frank's throat tightened. "That's beautiful, sweetheart. Is this something you'd like to try?" Lily looked up at him, and for a moment he thought she might speak. Her lips parted, her breath caught, but then she simply nodded and pointed to the drawing. That afternoon, Frank made several phone calls. First to Dr. Chen, who listened to his description of Lily's drawing with obvious excitement. Then to Jennifer, Lily's physical therapist, who agreed to modify their upcoming session to explore new possibilities. Finally to Carol at the animal shelter, who surprised him with information about Buddy's background that she hadn't shared during the adoption process. "I didn't want to influence your decision," Carol explained, "but Buddy came to us with some unusual training. His previous owner was elderly and used a mobility device. Buddy knows how to work with wheelchairs, how to provide stability support, even how to fetch items that have been dropped. He's not a certified service dog, but he has many of the skills." This revelation reframed everything Frank had observed over the past weeks. Buddy's intuitive behavior around Lily's wheelchair, his positioning during difficult moments, his calm response to medical equipment. It all made sense now. The next day brought their most ambitious outing yet. Frank had decided to take Lily to the town square, a central gathering place with wide sidewalks, accessible benches, and usually a friendly crowd of locals. It would be her first time in a truly public space since the accident, and Frank was nervous about how she might react to the attention and questions that were likely to come. But Buddy seemed to sense the importance of this expedition. He walked with particular dignity as they made their way from the parking area to the central fountain, his bearing conveying that he was not just a pet, but a working partner. When curious strangers approached, as Frank had known they would, Buddy positioned himself protectively beside Lily's chair, not aggressively, but in a way that created clear boundaries. "What a beautiful dog," said Mrs. Henderson from the library. "And Lily, how wonderful to see you out and about." In the past, such attention would have caused Lily to retreat completely, her head dropping and her hands folding tightly in her lap. Today, she reached down to touch Buddy's head and managed to make brief eye contact with Mrs. Henderson. It was a small interaction, but Frank saw it for the enormous victory it represented. They spent an hour at the square, watching other families, and enjoying the mild November weather. Several children approached, drawn by Buddy's gentle presence and curious about Lily's wheelchair. Frank tensed, ready to intervene if their questions became intrusive. But Buddy seemed to facilitate these interactions naturally. He would move closer to the visiting children, allowing them to pet him while keeping one eye on Lily, somehow making her wheelchair less noticeable and more approachable. One little girl, perhaps 4 years old, asked the question Frank had been dreading, "Why is she in that chair?" Before Frank could formulate a response, something remarkable happened. Lily reached into her bag and pulled out one of her sketches, a drawing she'd made the day before, showing herself, Buddy, and her grandfather together. She held it out to the little girl, who accepted it with delight. "Pretty picture," the child exclaimed. "Is this your doggy?" Lily nodded, and for the first time since the accident made a sound. It wasn't quite a word, more like a soft vocalization, but it was intentional communication. Frank felt tears spring to his eyes. The rest of the afternoon passed in a series of small miracles. Lily showed her drawings to several other children and adults, each interaction building her confidence. She began making more frequent eye contact, responding to questions with nods and gestures, and even initiated a few interactions by offering to share her sketchpad. On their way home, they stopped at the local library. Frank had been meaning to return some books and thought it might be good for Lily to see the children's section, perhaps select some new reading material. The librarian, Margaret Patterson, was a woman about Frank's age, with silver hair and a warm smile, who'd worked at the library for more than 20 years. "Frank Morrison," she said as they entered, "and this must be Lily. What a handsome companion you have there." Buddy seemed to recognize the library as a special kind of place. He walked even more quietly than usual, his nails making barely a whisper on the polished floors. When they reached the children's section, he settled beside Lily's wheelchair with the patience of a dog who understood that libraries were for quiet contemplation. "Would you like to see some books about dogs?" Margaret asked Lily gently. "We have some beautiful picture books about golden retrievers." To Frank's surprise, Lily nodded eagerly. Margaret selected several books from the shelves, and Lily began, turning pages with more interest than she'd shown in any reading material since the accident. One book in particular caught her attention, a story about a therapy dog who helps children in hospitals. "That's a very special kind of book," Margaret observed. "Dogs like the one in that story do important work, helping people feel better." Lily looked up at Buddy, then back at the book, and Frank could practically see the connections forming in her mind. She pointed to a picture of the therapy dog wearing a special vest, then touched Buddy's collar. "Buddy does help people feel better, doesn't he?" Frank said softly. "He helps you feel better." As they prepared to leave the library, Margaret walked them to the door. "You know, Frank, I've been working here a long time, and I've seen a lot of children. What you're doing with Lily, this is special. Don't underestimate the importance of what's happening here." That evening, as Frank helped Lily prepare for bed, she surprised him by reaching for the library books they'd checked out. She spent nearly an hour looking through the pictures, occasionally showing particularly interesting pages to Buddy, who regarded each image with appropriate seriousness. When Frank tucked her in, she reached under her pillow and pulled out a drawing he hadn't seen before. It was a picture of the three of them, but this time they were outside the library. Lily had drawn herself handing a book to another child, while Buddy sat between them. At the bottom of the page, in shaky but determined letters, she'd written a single word: "Help." Frank's voice caught in his throat. "Yes, sweetheart, Buddy does help, and maybe someday you and Buddy together can help other children too." She smiled and closed her eyes, her hand trailing down to rest on Buddy's head. As Frank turned off the light, he realized that what had started as a desperate attempt to reach his granddaughter had become something much larger. They were no longer just surviving. They were healing, growing, and beginning to imagine a future that included hope. 3 weeks after Buddy's arrival, The town square had become their regular destination. What started as a tentative exploration had evolved into a twice-weekly routine that both Lily and Frank looked forward to with genuine anticipation. The wrought-iron bench near the fountain had become their unofficial spot, a place where Lily could observe the rhythm of small-town life, while Buddy maintained his patient vigil beside her wheelchair. Frank had begun to recognize the other regulars, the elderly men who played chess at the concrete tables, the mothers who brought their toddlers to feed the ducks in the small pond, the teenagers who gathered after school to share secrets and dreams. Each group had gradually acknowledged their presence, offering waves and friendly greetings that Lily now returned with shy smiles and occasional gestures. The breakthrough came on a particularly busy Saturday afternoon in late November. The town's annual craft fair had transformed the square into a bustling marketplace, with local artisans displaying handmade jewelry, pottery, and woodwork. Frank had initially worried that the crowds and noise might overwhelm Lily, but Buddy's calm presence seemed to create a bubble of tranquility around her wheelchair. They were watching a glassblower demonstrate his craft when a family with 3 young children approached their bench. Frank recognized them as the Hendersons from church, people he'd known casually for years but hadn't spoken with since becoming Lily's guardian. "Frank, how nice to see you," said Janet Henderson, a kind-faced woman with patient eyes. "And Lily, what a beautiful friend you have there." Her youngest child, a boy about Lily's age named Michael, was immediately drawn to Buddy. "Can I pet your dog?" he asked, looking directly at Lily rather than directing the question to Frank. Lily glanced up at her grandfather, seeking reassurance, then nodded to Michael. As the boy knelt beside Buddy, stroking his golden fur with gentle hands, Lily pulled out her ever-present sketch pad. "Do you like to draw?" asked Michael, noticing the pad in her hands. Instead of withdrawing as Frank expected, Lily opened to a fresh page and began sketching. Within minutes, she'd created a recognizable portrait of Michael petting Buddy, complete with both boys' concentrated expressions, and Buddy's patient acceptance of the attention. "Wow, that's really good," Michael exclaimed, and his enthusiasm seemed to break through some invisible barrier. Lily tore the page from her pad and offered it to him, her first voluntary gift to another child since the accident. "Can you teach me how to draw like that?" Michael asked. And before Frank could intervene or make excuses, Lily was nodding and patting the bench beside her. What followed was 20 minutes of the most natural childhood interaction Frank had witnessed since the accident. Lily guided Michael through basic sketching techniques, using gestures and demonstrations rather than words, but her communication was clear and purposeful. She showed him how to capture Buddy's expression, how to make the fountain's spray look realistic, how to add depth to the drawing of people walking past. Janet Henderson watched with obvious amazement. "I haven't seen children connect like this in years," she said quietly to Frank. "Lily has such a gift for teaching." As the afternoon progressed, other children began to gather around their bench, drawn by Michael's excitement about his drawing lesson. Soon, Lily found herself at the center of an impromptu art class, with 5 young students eagerly attempting to replicate her techniques. Buddy seemed to understand his role in the proceedings, moving position when needed to give the children better angles for their sketches, accepting pets and attention from multiple small hands with characteristic patience. Frank found himself in conversation with the other parents, talking more freely than he had in months about Lily's progress, Buddy's remarkable intuition, and the small daily victories that had begun to accumulate into something resembling hope. "She's a natural teacher," observed Tom Bradley, whose 7-year-old daughter Emma had produced a surprisingly good sketch of the chess players under Lily's guidance. "Have you thought about getting her involved with other children more regularly?" The idea hadn't occurred to Frank, who'd been so focused on Lily's individual healing that he hadn't considered her potential impact on others. But watching her patient demonstrations and encouraging nods, he began to see possibilities that extended beyond their small household. As the craft fair wound down and families began gathering their belongings, Michael's mother made a suggestion that would change everything. "We have a children's art group that meets at the library every Thursday afternoon," Janet said. "It's just a few kids working on creative projects together. Do you think Lily might be interested in joining us?" Frank looked at his granddaughter, who was carefully organizing her art supplies, with Buddy lying contentedly at her feet. The idea of regular social interaction still seemed daunting, but today had proven that Lily was ready for challenges he'd been too cautious to consider. "What do you think, Lily?" he asked gently. "Would you like to go to art group with Michael and his friends?" Her response was immediate and clear, an enthusiastic nod followed by her brightest smile yet. She reached into her sketch pad and showed them a drawing she'd apparently been working on throughout their conversation. A picture of herself surrounded by children, all of them drawing together, while Buddy watched from the center of the group. The walk home that evening felt different from any they'd taken before. Lily's posture in her wheelchair seemed more upright, more confident. She made eye contact with every neighbor they passed, and when Mrs. Rodriguez waved from her garden, Lily actually lifted her hand in response. "You made some new friends today," Frank observed as they turned into their driveway. Lily nodded and pulled out her sketch pad again. This time, she showed him a drawing he hadn't seen her create, a picture of their house, but with an addition, a small art studio attached to the garage, filled with children and art supplies, with Buddy stationed by the door like a gentle guardian. Frank studied the drawing carefully, seeing not just artistic expression, but a vision of the future. "Is this something you'd like to have? A place where children could come to learn art?" Her nod was immediate and decisive, and for the first time since Sarah's death, Frank found himself thinking beyond immediate survival toward longer-term dreams and possibilities. That night, as he helped Lily prepare for bed, she surprised him by reaching for one of the library books about therapy dogs. She turned to a page showing a golden retriever working with children in a hospital setting and pointed to the dog, then to Buddy, then to herself. "You think Buddy could be a therapy dog?" Frank asked, though he was beginning to understand that. Buddy already was one, at least for Lily. She nodded solemnly and then did something that made Frank's heart skip. She pointed to herself and then to the children in the book, clearly indicating that she wanted to be part of helping others. As Frank tucked her in, Buddy taking his customary position on the floor beside her bed, he realized that their journey was entering a new phase. What had begun as one grandfather's desperate attempt to reach a traumatized child was evolving into something larger, a calling that might extend far beyond their small family. The house settled around them with the comfortable sounds of a home, where healing was happening, where hope was growing, and where tomorrow held possibilities that yesterday couldn't have imagined. The Thursday art group at the library became the anchor point around which their week revolved. Margaret Patterson had welcomed them with characteristic warmth, transforming the library's community room into a creative space where 6 children ranging in age from 5 to 8 could spread out their projects without worry about mess or noise. Lily's role in the group had evolved naturally from participant to informal instructor. While Margaret provided overall supervision and structured activities, the children instinctively turned to Lily for artistic guidance. Her patient demonstrations and encouraging gestures had a way of building confidence in even the most hesitant young artists. Buddy had become the group's unofficial mascot and emotional support system. He seemed to sense when a child was becoming frustrated with a difficult technique, moving closer to offer comfort. When Michael struggled with proportion in his drawings, Buddy would rest his chin on the boy's knee until his breathing slowed and his grip on the pencil relaxed. When Emma became overwhelmed by the complexity of a watercolor project, Buddy would settle beside her chair, his calm presence radiating the patience she needed to continue. Frank had taken to staying for the entire session, partly to help with logistics, but mostly because he enjoyed watching Lily's transformation. In this setting, surrounded by eager students and engaging in work she clearly loved, She seemed to shed years of trauma and become simply a child again, a gifted, generous child who had found her calling. It was during their fourth session that Frank noticed something peculiar about Buddy's behavior. The dog had developed what appeared to be preferences for certain art supplies, showing particular interest whenever anyone reached for the pencils or sketch pads. More unusually, he sometimes seemed to react to items that belonged to the children, before the children themselves noticed them. The mystery deepened when Emma accidentally knocked her pencil case off the table. Buddy immediately moved to the scattered supplies, but instead of simply sniffing them, he began nosing them into a specific arrangement. Frank watched with growing curiosity as the dog organized the pencils by color, creating a neat rainbow pattern that Emma exclaimed over with delight. "How did he know to do that?" Margaret asked, crouching down to examine Buddy's handiwork. "It's like he's done this before." That evening, Frank found himself studying Buddy with new attention. The dog's responses to art materials, his understanding of classroom dynamics, his intuitive knowledge of when children needed comfort or encouragement, it all suggested training that went beyond basic obedience or even typical therapy dog preparation. His investigation began with a phone call to Carol at the animal shelter. She listened to his observations with growing excitement, then made a confession that explained everything. "I should have told you sooner," she admitted, "but I was afraid it might influence your decision or make you feel pressured." Buddy didn't. Just come from a home with mobility equipment. His previous owner was Eleanor Mitchell, a retired art teacher who specialized in working with children with disabilities. She used Buddy as part of her therapy sessions for nearly 3 years before her husband's illness forced her to rehome him. The revelation reframed months of observations, Buddy's calm presence during art activities, his ability to organize supplies, his intuitive understanding of when children needed encouragement. These weren't random behaviors, but ingrained responses. From extensive training and experience, Frank's next call was to Eleanor Mitchell herself. The conversation that followed would change the trajectory of their entire family. Eleanor was a woman in her 70s, with a voice that carried both sadness and hope. She explained that she'd been forced to give up Buddy when her husband James, a Vietnam veteran struggling with PTSD, had become too ill for her to manage both his care and Buddy's needs. "James took his own life 6 months ago," she said quietly. "I've been thinking about Buddy every day since, wondering if he was all right, if he'd found the right family. When Carol told me about Lily, I cried with relief. She agreed to meet them the following Saturday, and Frank spent the intervening days preparing Lily for what might be an emotional encounter. He explained that Buddy had worked with other children before coming to live with them, that there was a lady who missed him very much, but wanted to make sure he was happy in his new home. The meeting took place at the town square, on their usual bench by the fountain. Eleanor arrived carrying a manila envelope and walking with the careful precision of someone managing grief and hope in equal measure. Buddy's reaction to seeing Eleanor was immediate and complex. His tail wagged with genuine recognition and affection, but he remained positioned beside Lily's wheelchair, clearly torn between past loyalty and present devotion. Eleanor knelt beside Buddy, her weathered hands stroking his familiar fur while tears streamed down her cheeks. "Hello, my good boy," she whispered. "I've missed you so much." Frank watched Lily carefully during this reunion, ready to intervene if she showed signs of distress or possessiveness. Instead, his granddaughter surprised him by reaching out to touch Eleanor's shoulder, offering the same gentle comfort she'd learned to give to upset children in art group. "You must be Lily," Eleanor said, looking up with eyes that sparkled despite her tears. "Buddy chose well. I can see how much he loves you." Eleanor opened her envelope and spread its contents on the bench between them. Photographs of Buddy working with children in art therapy sessions, certificates of training and achievement, and a thick folder of documentation about his specialized skills. "James and I trained him ourselves," she explained. "We worked with children who had experienced trauma, physical disabilities, emotional challenges. Buddy was never just a pet, he was a partner in healing." She showed them photographs of Buddy, helping a young boy with autism focus on a painting project, comforting a girl in a wheelchair who was struggling with a sculpture, organizing art supplies for a group of children with various developmental disabilities. "He knows more than 30 specific commands related to art therapy," Eleanor continued. "He can retrieve specific colors, organize supplies by category, provide stability for children with balance issues, and recognize signs of emotional distress before they escalate." Frank felt a mixture of amazement and inadequacy. They'd been benefiting from Buddy's expertise without understanding the depth of his training or the extent of his capabilities. "I need to ask you something," Eleanor said, her voice becoming more serious. "Would you be willing to let me work with you? Not to take Buddy back. I can see he belongs with Lily now, but to help you understand how to use his full potential." She explained that she'd been lost since James's death, unable to return to her work with children because the grief was too overwhelming, but seeing Buddy with Lily had awakened something she'd thought was gone forever. "I have 40 years of experience in art therapy," she said. "I understand trauma. I know how to work with children who can't or won't speak. And I can teach you techniques that might help Lily even more than she's already progressing." Frank looked at his granddaughter, who was listening to this conversation with intense concentration. Lily reached into her ever-present sketchpad and pulled out a drawing Frank hadn't seen before, a picture of their art group at the library, but with an additional figure, an older woman with silver hair standing beside the table. Helping children with their projects, Eleanor gasped when she saw the drawing. "How did she know? I haven't told her anything about what I used to do." "Lily sees things," Frank said simply. "She understands more than people realize." As their meeting concluded, they made plans for Eleanor to visit their Thursday art group, to observe and perhaps gradually become involved if the children responded well to her presence. Eleanor also offered to teach Frank and Lily advanced techniques for working with Buddy, helping them unlock abilities they hadn't known existed. Walking home that afternoon, Frank realized that their small circle was expanding in ways he'd never anticipated. What had started as one man's desperate attempt to help his traumatized granddaughter was becoming a network of healing that might eventually touch many lives. That night, as Lily showed Buddy her latest drawings, pictures that now included Eleanor as a regular part of their extended family, Frank reflected on the mysterious ways that loss and hope could intertwine. Eleanor had lost her husband and given up her beloved companion. Lily had lost her mother and her voice. He had lost his daughter and his confidence as a caregiver. But somehow, in the intersection of all these losses, they were finding something none of them could have discovered alone. The possibility that healing could be not just personal, but communal, not just about surviving trauma, but about transforming it into a source of strength for others. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early December, delivered by a courier who required Frank's signature and left him holding an envelope that would shatter the careful peace they'd built over the past 2 months. The return address read Mitchell and Associates Legal Services, and Frank's hands trembled slightly as he opened it while Lily worked on her morning sketches at the kitchen table, Buddy lying contentedly at her feet. The legal language was formal and cold, but the message was clear. Eleanor Mitchell was contesting the adoption of the dog known as Buddy, claiming that the animal had been surrendered to Maplewood Animal Shelter under false pretenses and without her full consent. According to the letter, Eleanor had been under severe emotional distress following her husband's suicide and was not in a proper mental state to make decisions about Buddy's future. She was now demanding his immediate return. Frank read the letter twice, his coffee growing cold as the implications sank in. This was not the same Eleanor who had wept with joy at seeing Buddy happy with Lily, who had offered to help them unlock his full potential as a therapy partner. This was legal action that threatened to tear apart the foundation of Lily's recovery. His hands shaking, Frank folded the letter and slipped it into his shirt pocket, just as Lily looked up from her sketchpad. Her intuitive abilities had grown, sharper over the weeks with Buddy, and she immediately sensed that something was wrong. Her eyes went from Frank's face to his pocket, where the letter created a visible bulge, and her expression shifted to one of concern. Before Frank could formulate an explanation or reassurance, the phone rang. He answered it with a heavy heart, already knowing what he would hear. "Mr. Morrison, this is David Mitchell, Eleanor's son. I'm calling about the letter you should have received this morning." Frank's initial reaction was anger, but David Mitchell's voice carried an exhaustion and sadness that tempered his response. "I don't understand," Frank said carefully, aware that Lily was watching his every expression. "Your mother seemed happy, that Buddy had found a good home. She wanted to help us work with him. My mother is not well, Mr. Morrison. She hasn't been well since my father's death. What you saw the other day, that was a good day. But she's been having episodes of severe depression, and her judgment isn't always sound. Yesterday she became convinced that giving up Buddy was a betrayal of my father's memory, that she needs him back to feel connected to Dad's final months." The conversation that followed revealed the complex reality of Eleanor's mental state. She was cycling through periods of clarity and confusion, sometimes remembering that she'd chosen to give Buddy up, other times believing he'd been taken from her against her will. Her psychiatrist had suggested that retrieving Buddy might provide stability, but her social worker worried about her ability to care for a large dog, given her current emotional fragility. "I don't want to hurt your granddaughter," David continued. "Mum told me about the progress Lily has made, but I'm concerned about my mother's well-being, and legally she may have grounds to reclaim him." After hanging up, Frank sat at his kitchen table, watching Lily sketch while his mind raced through possibilities and implications. The letter had mentioned a court hearing scheduled for the following week, which meant they had less than 7 days to prepare for what might be the fight of their lives. But even more challenging than the legal battle was the question of how to explain this threat to Lily without destroying the progress she'd made. For months, her entire world had revolved around the security of knowing that Buddy was hers, that their family was stable and permanent. The possibility of losing him might send her back into the silence and withdrawal they'd worked so hard to overcome. Frank's decision to tell her the truth came that afternoon, after he'd consulted with Dr. Chen and received her advice on how to approach such devastating news with a child who was still healing from trauma. They were in the living room, Lily working on a particularly detailed drawing, while Buddy dozed in his favorite spot near her wheelchair, when Frank pulled up a chair to sit at her eye level. "Lily, sweetheart, I need to talk to you about something important," he began gently. "It's about Buddy. And I need you to know that no matter what happens, Grandpa is going to do everything possible to keep our family together." Her pencil stopped moving. Her eyes, so much like her mother's, fixed on his face with an intensity that made his heart ache. Frank explained the situation as simply and honestly as he could. Eleanor was sad and confused because she missed her husband very much. Sometimes, when people are that sad, they make decisions that don't make sense. She was asking for Buddy to come back to her, and there might be people, judges and lawyers, who would have to decide what was best. As he spoke, Frank watched Lily's face transform through a series of emotions: confusion, fear, disbelief, and finally, a determination he hadn't seen since before the accident. She set down her pencil and reached into her sketchpad, pulling out a drawing she'd been working on secretly. The picture showed their Thursday art group, but with an important addition. Eleanor was there, helping children with their projects, while Buddy moved between them, offering comfort and assistance. At the bottom of the page, in letters that were becoming more confident each day, Lily had written, "Family." She pointed to Eleanor in the drawing, then to herself and Frank, then to Buddy. Her message was clear. They were all family now, and family didn't take things away from each other. That evening brought an unexpected phone call. Margaret Patterson from the library had heard about the legal challenge through the small-town network that carried news faster than any official communication system. "Frank, I hope you don't mind my calling," she said, "but I wanted you to know that there are people in this community who have seen what Lily and Buddy mean to each other. If you need character witnesses, if you need people to speak about the progress she's made, we're here." Over the next few days, Frank discovered the extent of the support system they'd unknowingly built. Janet Henderson organized a petition signed by every parent whose child had attended the art group, testifying to Lily's transformation and Buddy's therapeutic impact. Dr. Chen prepared a detailed report documenting Lily's progress and the critical role Buddy played in her continued recovery. Even Carol from the animal shelter offered to testify about the proper procedures followed during the adoption. But the most surprising support came from an unexpected source. On Friday afternoon, Eleanor herself appeared at their front door, looking frail and exhausted, but carrying a manila envelope similar to the one she'd shown them at their first meeting. "I need to talk to you," she said quietly. "I need to explain what's been happening, and I need to make something right." The conversation that followed revealed the depth of Eleanor's struggle with grief and the manipulation she'd experienced from well-meaning family members who thought they knew what was best for her. "I never wanted to take Buddy away from Lily," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I've been having dark days where I can't think clearly, and my son convinced me that I needed Buddy to get better. But seeing you all together, that's what made me feel better, not the idea of taking him back." She opened her envelope and pulled out official legal documents, papers that would withdraw her claim and formally transfer all rights to Buddy to the Morrison family. "James would never forgive me if I destroyed a child's healing for my own selfish grief," Eleanor continued. "And I've realized that I can still be part of Buddy's life, still benefit from his comfort without taking him away from where he belongs." She looked directly at Lily, who had been listening to this entire conversation with the same intense concentration she brought to her art projects. "Lily, would you be willing to share Buddy with me sometimes? Not to take him home, but to let me visit and maybe help with your art group. I think he has enough love for all of us." Lily's response was immediate and characteristic. She reached for her sketch pad and quickly drew a picture of Eleanor sitting in their living room, drinking tea with Frank while she and Buddy worked on art projects nearby. At the bottom, she wrote a single word: "Yes." As Eleanor prepared to leave, she handed Frank one final document, a detailed training manual for Buddy's specialized skills, including techniques and commands that could help maximize his therapeutic potential. "I should have given you this from the beginning," she said. "Buddy is capable of so much more than you know. With proper guidance, he and Lily together could help children in ways that might surprise you." That night, as Frank tucked Lily into bed with Buddy settled in his customary spot on the floor beside her, he reflected on how close they'd come to losing everything. But more than that, he marveled at how a crisis that could have destroyed them had instead revealed the strength of the community they'd built and the depth of love that surrounded their small family. Lily fell asleep, clutching a drawing she'd made that afternoon, a picture of their house with an addition she'd never shown him before. It depicted a large room filled with children, art supplies, and therapy dogs, with Eleanor and Margaret helping coordinate activities while Frank managed logistics. At the center of it all were Lily and Buddy, working together to bring healing and hope to other families who needed it. As Frank turned off the light, he realized that what had started as a threat to their happiness had actually revealed a vision of their future, a future that was larger and more meaningful than anything he could have imagined when they'd first walked into Maplewood Animal Shelter on that rainy afternoon that now seemed like a lifetime ago. The week following Eleanor's withdrawal of the legal challenge felt like the calm after a storm, but Frank sensed that their real test was yet to come. While the immediate threat to Buddy had passed, Eleanor's offer to help them understand his full potential opened doors to possibilities that were both exciting and daunting. Eleanor began visiting twice a week, bringing with her decades of expertise in art therapy and a deep understanding of how animals could facilitate healing in traumatized children. Her first official session with their Thursday group at the library revealed just how much they'd been underutilizing Buddy's remarkable capabilities. "Watch this," Eleanor said, positioning herself near the art supply table while Lily worked. With Michael on a watercolor landscape, she gave Buddy a subtle hand signal, a gesture so small Frank almost missed it. Buddy immediately moved to the supply table and began organizing the scattered paintbrushes by size, creating neat rows that made it easier for the children to select the tools they needed. When Emma accidentally knocked over her water jar, Buddy was there with a paper towel in his mouth before the spill could reach anyone's artwork. "He's been trained to anticipate needs and prevent problems before they escalate," Eleanor explained, quietly to Frank and Margaret, who were watching with amazement. In art therapy, maintaining flow and preventing frustration are crucial for keeping children engaged and confident. Over the following sessions, Eleanor demonstrated more of Buddy's specialized skills. He could retrieve specific colors when requested, provide steady support for children with mobility challenges, and most remarkably, seemed to recognize when a child was becoming overwhelmed and needed emotional support before the child had even unconsciously realized their distress. But it was Lily's response to this expanded understanding of Buddy's abilities that truly amazed everyone. Rather than feeling threatened by Eleanor's expertise or worried about sharing Buddy's attention, she seemed energized by the possibilities. Her artwork became more ambitious and detailed, and she began experimenting with techniques Eleanor suggested for working with other children who might face challenges similar to her own. The breakthrough came during their third week of Eleanor's involvement. A new child had joined their group, 7-year-old Marcus, whose selective mutism following his parents' divorce made him an ideal candidate for the kind of patient, non-verbal support that Lily and Buddy provided together. Marcus arrived at the library clutching his mother's hand, his eyes wide with anxiety about joining a group of strangers. While the other children gathered around the art table, he remained by the door, clearly wanting to participate but unable to overcome his fear. Frank watched as Lily observed Marcus for several minutes, her artist's eye taking in details that others might miss. The way he watched the art supplies with longing, how his foot tapped against the floor in rhythm with his nervous energy, the fact that his backpack contained a small sketchbook that he kept hidden but occasionally touched. Without any direction from Eleanor or Margaret, Lily maneuvered her wheelchair to a position near Marcus, but not directly approaching him. Close, enough to invite interaction, but far enough away to avoid triggering his anxiety. Buddy, responding to signals so subtle they seemed telepathic, moved to a position between Lily and Marcus, creating a bridge of calm presence. Then Lily began to draw, but unlike her usual focused work, this drawing was clearly intended as a performance for Marcus's benefit. She worked slowly and deliberately, creating a picture of children engaged in various art activities, while a golden dog moved among them, helping and encouraging. Marcus's fascination was immediate and obvious. He took several small steps closer, drawn by the emerging artwork and Buddy's patient presence. When Lily deliberately dropped her pencil, clearly intentionally, Buddy retrieved it and brought it to Marcus instead of returning it to Lily. The boy's face lit up with surprise and delight. He accepted the pencil and, after a moment's hesitation, approached Lily's table. Without words, she gestured for him to add something to her drawing. His contribution was tentative at first, a small bird in the sky above the children, but Lily's encouraging smile and Buddy's approving tail wag gave him confidence to add more details. By the end of the session, Marcus had created his first collaborative artwork and had pet Buddy extensively, his anxiety replaced by the kind of focused engagement that Eleanor recognized as the beginning of therapeutic breakthrough. "What Lily did today," Eleanor told Frank afterward, "is something I've seen trained therapists struggle to accomplish. She has an intuitive understanding of how to create safe spaces for frightened children." That evening, as they sat in Frank's living room with Buddy contentedly stretched across both their feet, Eleanor broached the subject that had been growing in all their minds. "I've been thinking about what comes next," she said carefully. "Lily's progress has been remarkable, but I'm beginning to wonder if we're thinking too small about what she and Buddy might accomplish together." She pulled out a folder Frank hadn't seen before, filled with research articles about animal-assisted therapy programs and case studies of children who had become peer counselors for other trauma survivors. There are programs around the country where children who have experienced healing become advocates and helpers for others facing similar challenges, Eleanor explained. With proper support and training, Lily could become a powerful force for helping other kids who have lost their voices. Frank felt a mixture of pride and protective anxiety. The idea of Lily helping other children was beautiful, but he worried about placing too much responsibility on shoulders that were still healing from their own trauma. What would that look like practically, he asked. Eleanor's vision was both comprehensive and thoughtful. She imagined expanding their Thursday group to include more children with various challenges, physical disabilities, selective mutism, trauma-related communication issues. She pictured Lily and Buddy working together, under professional supervision, to provide peer support and artistic expression opportunities. "We could start small," she suggested. "Maybe invite a few more children like Marcus, kids who might benefit from Lily's patient approach and Buddy's therapeutic presence. See how it develops naturally." Frank looked at Lily, who had been listening to this conversation while sketching in her ever-present pad. She held up her latest drawing, a large room filled with children of various ages and abilities, all working on art projects while several therapy dogs moved among them. At the center were herself and Buddy, but they weren't alone. Eleanor was there providing guidance, Margaret was organizing supplies, and Frank was helping coordinate activities. But the most significant detail was at the top of the page, a sign that read, "Morrison Family Art Therapy Center." "Is this something you want, sweetheart?" Frank asked gently. Lily's nod was immediate and decisive. Then she surprised them both by reaching for a pencil, and in letters that were becoming stronger and more confident each day, she wrote at the bottom of her drawing, "Help kids like me." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Lily, you understand, don't you? You know that your healing isn't just about you, it's about what you can give to others who need hope." Over the following days, Frank found himself researching the legal and practical requirements for establishing some kind of formal program. The logistics seemed overwhelming. Insurance, certifications, space requirements, professional oversight, but the vision Lily had drawn kept pulling him forward. The turning point came when Dr. Chen, during her regular session with Lily, endorsed the idea with enthusiasm that surprised Frank with its intensity. "Frank, what you're considering could be groundbreaking," she said after observing Lily work with Marcus again. "I've been watching her develop skills that some of my graduate students struggle to master. Her ability to create emotional safety for other children is remarkable." Dr. Chen offered to provide professional supervision and help navigate the requirements for establishing a legitimate art therapy program. Margaret volunteered the library's community spaces and offered to help with administrative coordination. Carol from the animal shelter suggested they could train additional therapy dogs to work with other children as the program grew. But the most significant endorsement came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Peterson, the social worker who had been overseeing Lily's case since the accident. During a routine visit, she observed Lily working with Marcus and immediately recognized the therapeutic potential of what she was witnessing. In 20 years of social work, I've rarely seen anything as powerful as what happened in that room. Today, she told Frank, Lily didn't just help that little boy feel comfortable, she gave him permission to communicate in his own way, at his own pace. That's professional-level intuition. As December progressed toward the holidays, Frank realized they were approaching a crossroads. They could continue with their small Thursday group, maintaining the comfortable routine that had brought them so much healing. Or they could take the leap towards something larger and more ambitious, a formal program that could touch many more lives but would require significant courage and commitment. The decision would ultimately be Lily's, but Frank sensed that she had already made her choice. Every drawing she created now included more children, more therapy dogs, more opportunities to share the healing they had discovered together. Her vision was expanding beyond their small world to embrace a community of children who needed what she and Buddy could offer. On the evening before their meeting with state officials, Frank found Lily in her room, working by lamplight on her most ambitious drawing yet. The sketch showed a large building with multiple rooms, each filled with different therapeutic activities. In one room, children worked on paintings while therapy dogs provided comfort. In another, older kids like her self-taught art techniques to younger ones. A third space showed group sessions where children shared their stories through visual expression. "This is what you want, isn't it?" Frank said softly, sitting on the edge of her bed. "Not just to help a few children in our Thursday group, but to create something bigger?" Lily set down her pencil and looked at him with eyes that held wisdom, far beyond her 7 years. Then she reached for the notebook where she'd been practicing her writing and carefully formed the words that would define their future. "Children need voices. I can teach them how to find theirs." Frank felt his heart swell with pride and protective concern in equal measure. His little granddaughter had found her purpose in life, but it was a purpose that would require courage, commitment, and the willingness to step far beyond the safe boundaries they'd established. As he tucked her in that night, with Buddy settling into his customary position beside her bed, Frank made his own decision. Whatever tomorrow brought, whatever challenges lay ahead, he would support Lily's vision and help her transform her personal healing into a gift for countless other children who were still searching for their own voices in the darkness. The call came on a Friday morning in mid-December, just as Frank was helping Lily prepare for what had become their most ambitious art therapy session yet. Margaret had arranged for the library's main conference room to accommodate 8 children, including 3 new participants who had been referred by Dr. Chen and the local children's hospital. Mr. Morrison, the voice on the phone, was professional, but carried an undertone of urgency. "This is Patricia Holmes from the Department of Health and Human Services. We've received reports about therapeutic activities involving children and an unlicensed animal at the public library. We need to schedule an immediate inspection." Frank's heart sank. Someone, he suspected a well-meaning parent or perhaps a concerned official, had reported their growing program to state authorities. While their intentions were purely beneficial, they had been operating without the formal permits and certifications required for any program involving children and therapy animals. "I understand your concern," Frank said carefully, watching Lily's face as she sensed the tension in his voice. "We're just a small group of children doing art projects together. Nothing formal or—" "Mr. Morrison, we have reports of a child in a wheelchair providing unsupervised counseling to other minors, with an uncertified animal present during therapeutic interventions. This falls under our jurisdiction for child welfare and public safety." The inspection was scheduled for the following Tuesday, the day after their most important session yet. Dr. Chen had arranged for colleagues from the Children's Hospital to observe Lily's work with Marcus and 2 new children with selective mutism. Eleanor had invited a certified animal therapy specialist to evaluate Buddy's skills and potentially begin the process of official certification. Now, instead of celebrating their progress, Frank found himself facing the possibility that their entire program could be shut down before it had truly begun. He broke the news to Lily as gently as possible, explaining that some people were worried about safety and wanted to make sure everyone was being properly protected. Her response was immediate and heartbreaking, the first sign of real distress he'd seen from her since Buddy's arrival. She pulled out her sketch pad and began drawing frantically, creating image after image of empty rooms, closed doors, and children standing alone without the companionship of therapy dogs. At the bottom of one particularly poignant drawing, a picture of Marcus sitting by himself while other children played in the distance, she wrote in increasingly agitated letters, "No, no, no." Frank called an emergency meeting for that afternoon. Eleanor, Margaret, Dr. Chen and Mrs. Peterson gathered in Frank's living room while Lily worked on her art nearby, Buddy maintaining his customary position beside her wheelchair. "The problem is that we've been operating in a grey area," Dr. Chen explained. "What Lily does naturally, creating emotional safety, facilitating non-verbal communication, providing peer support, these are activities that typically require professional oversight when done in a formal setting. Eleanor was pragmatic about their options. We can either scale back to a simple art club with no therapeutic claims, or we can fast-track the certification process and try to legitimize what we're doing. The fast-track option would require Dr. Chen to formally supervise all sessions, Eleanor to complete certification as a volunteer art therapist, and Buddy to undergo official evaluation as a therapy animal. Most challenging of all, they would need to establish a legal framework for the program and find appropriate insurance coverage. "How long would all that take?" Frank asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Under normal circumstances, several months," Dr. Chen replied. "But given the immediate deadline and the obvious benefits we've all witnessed, I'm willing to call in some favors and see if we can expedite things." Mrs. Peterson offered the most practical perspective. "The inspector's primary concern will be child safety and proper oversight. If we can demonstrate that qualified professionals are involved and that appropriate safeguards are in place, we might be able to continue operating while the formal certification process proceeds." That weekend became a whirlwind of phone calls, paperwork, and rapid-fire arrangements. Dr. Chen contacted colleagues at the state level to expedite Buddy's therapy animal evaluation. Eleanor enrolled in an intensive volunteer training program that typically took weeks, but was being compressed into 3 days. Frank found himself navigating insurance requirements and liability waivers with the help of a lawyer Margaret recommended. But the most significant development came from Lily herself. On Sunday evening, as Frank struggled with a particularly complex form about program objectives and therapeutic goals, she approached him with her sketchpad. The drawing she showed him was different from any she'd created before. Instead of depicting their program as she imagined it might be, she had drawn a detailed scene of their actual Thursday sessions, showing specific moments when she had helped other children overcome their fears or express themselves through art. In one corner, she had drawn herself guiding Marcus through his first successful collaborative drawing. In another, she showed her patient demonstration of watercolor techniques to a girl with motor skill challenges. At the center was Buddy, but not just as a comfort animal. She had captured him in the act of performing specific tasks that help children focus and feel safe. At the bottom of the page, in her most careful handwriting yet, she had written, "This is real. This helps. Please don't stop." Frank realized that Lily understood exactly what was at stake. This wasn't just about continuing a pleasant weekly activity. It was about preserving something that had become central to her identity and purpose. Monday's session proceeded with unusual formality. Dr. Chen attended as official supervisor, taking careful notes about interactions and therapeutic outcomes. Eleanor documented Buddy's responses to various situations, building a case for his natural therapy skills. Margaret coordinated activities with the precision of someone who understood that every detail might be scrutinized. The children, of course, were unaware of the adult tensions surrounding their activities. Marcus worked on a painting of his family, with Lily's gentle guidance, making more progress in one session than he had achieved in months of traditional therapy. The two new children, Emma, who struggled with anxiety following a car accident, and David, whose autism made social interaction difficult, both responded positively to the combination of Lily's patient instruction and Buddy's calming presence. As the session concluded, Frank felt cautiously optimistic. They had documentation of genuine therapeutic benefit, professional oversight, and clear evidence that their informal program was achieving results that traditional approaches hadn't matched. But Tuesday morning brought an unexpected complication. Inspector Patricia Holmes arrived not alone, but accompanied by a second official from the state's Animal Control Division and a third from the Department of Professional Licensing. "Mr. Morrison," Inspector Holmes said as Frank welcomed them, "into the library's conference room. We appreciate your cooperation with this investigation. We understand that your intentions have been good, but we need to ensure that all activities involving children and animals meet state safety and licensing requirements." Frank had prepared for questions about supervision and liability, but the animal control officer's concerns were more fundamental. "This dog," he said, studying Buddy with professional skepticism, "has no certification as a therapy animal. We have no documentation of his training, his health records from previous situations, or his behavioral assessment under stress. Without proper certification, he cannot legally participate in any structured activity involving minors." Frank felt the bottom drop out of his carefully constructed optimism. They had focused so intensely on human certifications and professional oversight that they had underestimated the complexity of legitimizing Buddy's role in their program. The inspection had taken an ominous turn, but Frank was not prepared for what happened next. As the three officials continued their questioning about Buddy's credentials, Lily entered the conference room in her wheelchair, having been escorted by Margaret from the children's section where she had been waiting with Eleanor. The moment Buddy saw the strangers examining his documentation and discussing his future, something shifted in his demeanor. The calm, patient dog, who'd become the cornerstone of their therapeutic program, suddenly displayed an alertness and intelligence that even Frank hadn't fully recognized. Buddy approached the animal control officer directly, sat with perfect posture, and began demonstrating behaviors that left everyone in the room speechless. Without any commands from Frank or Eleanor, he performed a series of complex tasks, organizing scattered papers on the table by size, retrieving a dropped pen and placing it precisely in front of Inspector Holmes, and most remarkably, moving to Lily's wheelchair and positioning himself to provide stability support while she transferred from the chair to a regular seat. "Where did he learn those behaviors?" the licensing officer asked, his skepticism replaced by professional interest. Eleanor stepped forward with the manila envelope she had brought but hadn't yet opened. "If I may, I can provide documentation that you haven't seen yet." She spread across the table certificates, training records, and professional evaluations that painted a complete picture of Buddy's background. He had not only been trained by Eleanor and her late husband, but had actually been evaluated and temporarily certified as a therapy animal before James's death interrupted the process. "These records show 18 months of intensive training," Eleanor explained, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "Buddy was working with children in supervised therapeutic settings for nearly 2 years before circumstances forced me to surrender him." But the most compelling evidence came from Lily herself. As the adults discussed certifications and regulations, she had been quietly working on a drawing. Now, she held up a detailed illustration that documented specific instances where Buddy's interventions had prevented problems or facilitated breakthroughs with other children. In one corner of the drawing, she had captured the moment when Buddy had prevented Emma from knocking over paint water by gently nudging her elbow. In another section, she showed him providing stability support for a child with balance issues. At the center was a scene that Frank had witnessed, but not fully understood at the time. Buddy positioning himself between Marcus and the door during his first session, creating a psychological barrier that helped the anxious boy feel safe enough to participate. Inspector Holmes studied the drawing with growing amazement. "She's documenting therapeutic interventions," she said quietly. "This child is observing and recording professional-level behavioral support." Then Lily did something that changed everything. She set down her pencil, looked directly at Inspector Holmes, and spoke her first words to a stranger since the accident. "Buddy saves children," she said, her voice soft but clear. "He saved me. He saves Marcus. He saves Emma and David. Please don't take him away from children who need saving." The room fell completely silent. Frank felt tears spring to his eyes, not just at hearing Lily speak, but at the courage it had taken for her to find her voice at the moment when it mattered most. Inspector Holmes knelt beside Lily's chair, her professional demeanor softened by obvious emotion. "Lily, can you tell me more about how Buddy helps other children?" What followed was the most extensive verbal communication Lily had attempted since the accident. In simple but clear language, she explained how Buddy seemed to understand when children were scared, how he knew to bring supplies when someone needed help, how his presence made it easier for kids to try new things and express their feelings through art. "He doesn't just make us feel better," she said, her confidence growing with each sentence. "He helps us be brave enough to help each other." The animal control officer's expression had shifted from skepticism to professional respect. "Miss Lily, what you're describing sounds like very advanced therapy animal behavior. Has anyone taught you how to work with Buddy, or does this just happen naturally?" "Eleanor teaches us both," Lily replied, looking toward Eleanor with obvious affection. "But Buddy already knew how to help. He just needed children to help." Inspector Holmes exchanged glances with her colleagues, and Frank could see their evaluation of the situation changing in real time. They had come expecting to find well-meaning amateurs potentially putting children at risk. Instead, they were witnessing a sophisticated therapeutic partnership that was achieving results beyond what many formal programs accomplished. "Dr. Chen," Inspector Holmes said, "in your professional opinion, what is the therapeutic value of what you've observed here?" Dr. Chen's response was measured but enthusiastic. "In 30 years of practice, I've rarely seen anything as effective as the combination of Lily's peer support and Buddy's behavioral interventions. They're achieving breakthrough results with children who haven't responded to traditional approaches." The licensing officer asked the question that Frank had been dreading. What would it take to make this program fully compliant with state regulations? Eleanor stepped forward with a proposal she had been preparing since learning about the inspection. "I've been in contact with the State Board of Therapy Animal Certification. Given Buddy's existing training records and demonstrated abilities, they're willing to fast-track his full certification if we can provide supervised documentation of his work over the next 30 days. She had also researched the requirements for establishing a legitimate art therapy program. With Dr. Chen's supervision, Margaret's administrative support, and proper insurance coverage, they could continue operating while completing the certification process. The children would be safe, Eleanor continued. The program would have professional oversight, and we could expand to help more kids like Marcus and Emma. Inspector Holmes looked at Lily, who was watching this entire conversation with the same focused attention she brought to her artwork. "Lily, if we allow this program to continue while everyone gets the proper certifications, would you like to keep helping other children?" Lily's response was immediate and clear. "Yes, please. Children need help, and Buddy and I know how to give it." The final decision came after a brief consultation among the three officials. They would allow the program to continue under Dr. Chen's formal supervision, with the understanding that all certification requirements would be completed within 60 days. Buddy would undergo official evaluation within 2 weeks, and Eleanor would complete her volunteer certification during the same period. As the officials prepared to leave, Inspector Holmes made one final observation that would stay with Frank long after they were gone. In 20 years of inspecting programs for children, I've never seen a case where the supposed problem was actually the solution, she said. What you've created here isn't just compliant with our regulations. It's an example of what those regulations are trying to encourage. After the officials left, Frank found himself alone with Lily and Buddy in the conference room, while Eleanor and Margaret handled remaining paperwork. His granddaughter was working on a new drawing, a picture of their expanded program with official certificates hanging on the walls, and more children than they had ever served before. "You found your voice today, when it really mattered," Frank said gently. Lily looked up from her drawing and smiled. "Buddy taught me that sometimes you have to speak up to protect what you love." She returned to her sketch, adding final details to a scene that showed not just their current Thursday group, but a vision of something larger: multiple therapy dogs, working with dozens of children, professional therapists, collaborating with peer mentors, and at the center of it all, a little girl who had transformed her own healing into a gift for others. Frank realized that what had started as a crisis threatening to destroy their program had actually become the moment when their small, informal art group evolved into something with the potential to change lives far beyond what any of them had originally imagined. 6 months later, on a warm spring morning that carried the scent of blooming dogwood trees and fresh possibilities, Frank stood in the doorway of what had once been an empty storefront on Main Street. The Morrison Family Art Therapy Center had grown beyond anything he could have imagined when he'd first wheeled Lily into Maplewood Animal Shelter on that desperate rainy afternoon. The transformation was remarkable. What had started as a small Thursday group at the library now occupied a bright, accessible space with specialized areas for different types of therapeutic activities. The main room accommodated 12 children at a time, with adjustable tables and chairs designed for various physical abilities. A quiet corner provided space for one-on-one sessions, while a large area near the windows allowed for group projects and collaborative art. But the most significant change was in the children themselves. Marcus, the boy who had arrived unable to speak, now served as one of Lily's assistant instructors, helping newer children overcome their initial anxiety. Emma had regained her confidence after the car accident and was working on a mural depicting stories of courage and recovery. David, whose autism had made social interaction challenging, had discovered a gift for detailed technical drawings that other children admired and tried to emulate. 3 certified therapy dogs now worked in the program alongside Buddy, each matched to specific children based on temperament and needs. But Buddy remained the senior partner, the dog whose intuitive understanding of therapeutic needs had become legendary among the professional staff who now supported their work. Eleanor had completed her certification and become the program's official art therapy coordinator, bringing 4 decades of experience to bear on their expanding mission. Dr. Chen provided weekly supervision and had begun documenting their methods for potential publication in professional journals. Margaret had taken early retirement from the library to become their full-time administrative director, handling the growing waiting list of children referred by schools, hospitals, and social service agencies throughout the region. The morning routine had become a cherished ritual. Frank arrived early to prepare the space, checking supplies and ensuring that each child's work from the previous session was displayed exactly as they had left it. Lily came next, often arriving before the center officially opened because she enjoyed the quiet time to review her notes and plan activities for children who were struggling with particular challenges. Her transformation was the most remarkable of all. The silent, withdrawn child who had lived in a prison of trauma had become a confident young leader whose patient instruction and intuitive understanding had helped more than 50 children begin their own healing journeys. She spoke regularly, now her voice clear and strong when advocating for the needs of other children or explaining therapeutic techniques to visiting professionals. But perhaps most significantly, she had become a bridge between the world of formal therapy and the simple truth that healing often happens best when it's shared between people who understand each other's struggles. The center's success had attracted attention from universities and medical institutions interested in studying their peer support model. Dr. Chen had received a research grant to document their methods and outcomes, with preliminary results suggesting that children who participated in their program showed faster and more lasting recovery from trauma than those in traditional therapy alone. Frank had never imagined himself as the director of a non-profit organization, but that's what he had become. His practical skills in organization and problem-solving, combined with his deep love for Lily and growing understanding of therapeutic principles, had made him an effective advocate for their expanding mission. He'd learned to navigate insurance, requirements, grant applications, and the complex regulations governing programs that served vulnerable children. The financial support had come from unexpected sources. The community had embraced their work with donations both large and small. A local foundation had provided startup funding after observing their results with children other programs hadn't been able to reach. Most recently, they had received a significant grant from a national organization devoted to innovative approaches to childhood trauma recovery. But success brought new challenges. The waiting list for their program now extended months into the future, and they were constantly balancing the desire to help more children with the need to maintain the intimate, personal approach that made their work effective. On this particular morning, Frank was preparing for a visit from a delegation of professionals from the state capital who were interested in replicating their model in other communities. The thought was both exciting and daunting. The possibility that Lily's healing journey might eventually help thousands of children she would never meet. As the first children arrived for the day's sessions, Frank watched Lily greet each one, individually, asking about their week, commenting on their progress, and helping them settle into the day's activities. Buddy moved among them with his characteristic dignity, offering comfort where needed and celebrating achievements with gentle tail wags and patient attention. Mrs. Henderson brought her youngest daughter, Sarah, who was beginning her recovery from selective mutism following her parents' divorce. Marcus immediately positioned himself to help the new girl feel welcome, showing her the supply areas and introducing her to the therapy dogs. Emma offered to share her watercolors, and David, who had once struggled to interact with anyone, demonstrated proper brush care with the patience of a natural teacher. Eleanor worked with two teenagers who were dealing with depression, using art therapy techniques that helped them express feelings they couldn't yet put into words. Dr. Chen observed a session with 3 siblings whose family had been affected by domestic violence, taking notes that would contribute to their ongoing research about the effectiveness of peer support in trauma recovery. As Frank watched this carefully orchestrated dance of healing and hope, he reflected on how far they had all traveled from that desperate afternoon when he had run out of ideas for helping his granddaughter. What had started as one grandfather's last attempt to reach a traumatized child had evolved into a community of healing that touched dozens of families. The lunch break brought a surprise visitor. Carol from Maplewood Animal Shelter arrived with a golden retriever puppy, 8 weeks old, and already showing signs of the calm temperament that made for effective therapy work. "This little guy is Buddy's nephew," she explained, kneeling so the children could meet their potential new teammate. "Same parents, similar personality. We're wondering if you might be ready to start training your own therapy dog from puppyhood." Lily's face lit up with the same transformative smile Frank remembered from that first day at the shelter. But this time, her response included words that captured the full scope of their mission. "We'll call him Hope," she said, gently holding the puppy, while Buddy investigated his young relative with patient interest. "Because that's what we do here. We give children hope, and we teach them how to give it to others." The afternoon brought the visit from the state delegation, but Frank found he was no longer nervous about their evaluation. The work spoke for itself. Children who had been isolated by trauma were learning to trust and communicate again. Families who had felt hopeless were rediscovering joy and connection, and a community that had seemed indifferent to the struggles of its most vulnerable members had become actively engaged in supporting their healing. As the delegation observed sessions and interviewed staff members, Frank overheard one official comment to another. "This isn't just an art therapy program. It's a model for how communities can rally around their children in crisis." The day concluded with their traditional circle time, where children who felt comfortable doing so shared something positive about their week or their artwork. Marcus talked about helping his little sister feel brave during a thunderstorm. Emma described a conversation she'd had with her mother about the accident that had previously been too frightening to discuss. David announced that he had been selected to display his technical drawings in the school's art show, and Lily, who had once lived in complete silence, stood to address the group with the confidence of someone who had found not just her voice, but her calling. "Every person in this room has something difficult in their life," she said, looking around the circle at children and adults alike. "But every person in this room also has gifts that can help other people feel less alone with their difficult things. That's why we're here together, not just to get better, but to get better so we can help others get better too." As families collected their children and the day's activities wound down, Frank found himself alone with Lily and Buddy in the quiet center, surrounded by artwork that told stories of courage, resilience, and hope. "Are you proud of what we've built here?" he asked his granddaughter, who was carefully organizing art supplies for tomorrow's sessions. Lily looked around the space they had created. Walls covered with children's artwork, therapy dogs resting contentedly in their designated areas, professional certificates hanging beside hand-drawn pictures of healing and hope, and smiled with deep satisfaction. "I'm proud of what we're still building," she replied, "because every day more children learn that they're not alone, and every day they learn they can help other children not be alone either. That's not something you finish. That's something you keep doing forever." As they prepared to leave for the day, Frank noticed that Lily had left a new drawing on her work table, a picture of the center as she envisioned it 5 years in the future. The space was larger, filled with more children, more therapy dogs, more caring adults who had once been helped and were now helping others in return. At the center of the drawing were the 3 figures who had started it all. An elderly man who had learned that love could overcome his fear of inadequacy, a young girl who had discovered that her voice was most powerful when used to advocate for others, and a golden retriever who had proven that healing often arrives on 4 paws and a patient heart. The golden afternoon light filtering through their windows seemed to promise that tomorrow would bring new children who needed hope, new families who needed support, and new opportunities to transform personal healing into community strength. Frank locked the door behind them, but he knew that what they had created here would continue growing long after any of them were gone. They had built something that was larger than any individual story of recovery. They had created a legacy of love that would touch lives for generations to come. As they walked toward home together, Lily pushing herself confidently in her wheelchair, while Buddy maintained his loyal position beside her, Frank realized that the desperate prayer he had whispered on that rainy day at the animal shelter had been answered in ways more beautiful and far-reaching than he could ever have imagined. Sometimes miracles don't announce themselves with fanfare. Sometimes they arrive quietly, on 4 paws and a gentle heart, and grow into something that changes not just one life, but an entire community's understanding of what healing can accomplish when it's shared with love.